Today I'm going to show you everything you need to know about the Three Musketeers. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about this version of the Three Musketeer deck, but keep in mind that there are other variations of the deck floating around, so use whatever feels comfortable with you. But for the most part, if you run into Three Musketeers, it's probably a variation of this deck, so this video will still help you regardless. So with all that being said, let's start with the stars of the show, the Three Musketeers. The Three Musketeers is a 9-elixir card that gives us Three Musketeers. Pretty simple. However, this card is super squishy and is super vulnerable to spells, so in order to get maximum value, you always split the Musketeers so they don't get destroyed by spells. This is your win condition after all, and your main goal is to make 2 equal pushes and overwhelm your opponent. This card is very expensive, so I would highly recommend waiting up to double elixir before starting your pushes. This doesn't mean you shouldn't use Three Musketeers in single elixir, just use them as you see fit. If your opponent has Lumber Balloon, you may need them. If they have Lava Hound, probably get them out. You just might need to use them on defense. But for your main pushes, I would recommend waiting up to double elixir to take out your opponent. Another tip for Three Musketeers is try to bait out their heavy spells before using them. These are your win conditions after all, you don't want them to die on your side of the arena. So use Elixir Pump to bait your opponent's spell so you can get a push started and hopefully win the match. Whenever supporting the Three Musketeers, I would try to make 2 equal pushes. Don't try to make a big push and a kind of a decent push on the other side. Try to make them as equal as possible so your opponent can't just focus on one push and has to focus equally on both. When doing this, this kind of deters your opponent from using spells and taking out your entire push, so try to make them as equal as possible. Wherever you place them is up to you, but I would recommend placing them in the back so you can build the biggest push possible. However, if you do defend against a heavy push and have troops remaining, you can place the Musketeers next to the bridge along with some bridge spam to make a quick sort of makeshift Three Musketeer push. One more tip is you can also use the deadly Pocket Planet Musketeers, which is devastating if you catch your opponent off guard. You can probably use this only once per match. Other than that, your opponent's going to be trying to prevent any other Pocket Musketeers. But if done correctly, you can potentially take down their tower. The Elixir Pump is the backbone of all heavy pushes. Three Musketeers is expensive, so to make up for this, we have Elixir Pump. If a successful pump is on the field, this allows us to make 2 equal pushes to overwhelm our opponents. This card is pretty simple. It costs 6 elixir and produces 8 elixir if left undisturbed. For the most part, whenever a spell is used upon a pump, it denies a similar amount of elixir to what that spell cost. But a pump can be devastating if left alone, so expect your pump to make great spell bait. If you watch my Grand Challenge videos, you may know my motto: cycle to pump. Whenever I place a pump, my main goal is to try to outcycle my opponent's spells, and if I'm fast enough, I may be able to place a pump before my opponent has their spell in cycle. But for the most part, I have to rely on cheaper cards in my deck to hopefully outpace their spells. In this replay, I was able to slowly outcycle my opponent's spells. It even got to a point where he had to even ignore one of my pumps. And after I defended against his heavy push, I knew he had his spell in cycle, so I proceeded to place another pump down as spell bait so I could safely put my Three Musketeers down without having to worry about them getting destroyed. There are 3 main places where I like to place pump, which are in the corners of the map, in front of the King Tower, and even hugging the King Tower. For the most part, I would recommend the first 2 options since they work pretty well against spells, but if your opponent has Goblin Drill or the Graveyard, then I would recommend hugging the King Tower for a potential King Tower activation. If your opponent has Rocket or Miner, I would recommend putting it in front of the King Tower, but for the most part, just keep it in the corners of the map and it'll be fine. You can also use Pump as a defensive card, but this is really a last case scenario in case you just need a little bit more time and you just need to protect your tower from a Royal Giant or something. Some other tips for the Elixir Pump is try not to place it without having spare elixir, since Pump is expensive and your opponent can easily rush you if you're not careful. So whenever I place pumps, I make sure to have 1 or 2 extra elixir just in case they decide to rush me or anything. Other than that, I would recommend having at least 1 successful pump before starting any heavy pushes. Before we start talking about Zap and Three Musketeers, there are some alternative options you may want to know about. Other cards other people may include instead of Zap may include Barbarian Barrel, the Log, and maybe even Rage nowadays. If you're having trouble against goblins, try the Logs. If you're very skillful, use Barbarian Barrel. And if you want to get spicy, use the Rage. But I wouldn't recommend it, it's really weird, I don't like it. Each spell has their own benefits and downfalls, which I will talk about in another video. But let's get back to Zap. Zap's purpose is to defend against other swarm troops such as Goblin Barrel, Goblins, Skeleton Army, and even the minions. This card works both great on offense as well as defense. Zap on offense can give you a lot of chip damage with your bridge spam troops and allow pushes to demolish a tower with a little distraction. So if you pair this up with the Elite Barbarians, you'll be an unstoppable force that can potentially take down your opponent's tower. Personally, I use Zap because of its quick deployment, which can shock your opponents and get your pushes through. Zap also hits air troops, unlike the Log and Barbarian Barrel. That's another reason I like Zap, because the Log and Barbarian Barrel leaves Three Musketeers as your only anti-air, which is not the best against minions and Lava Hound. And if paired with Heal Spirit, this makes an amazing combo, which is just as deadly as the Log. It will take down any troops that aren't normally killed by Zap, such as goblins, minions, and even those Lava Hound pups. Zap might give you just the amount of damage your troops needs to one-shot them. For example, if you place elite barbarians at the bridge and your opponent plays zappies, if you zap them, this allows your elite barbarians to one-shot them and get to your opponent's tower faster. Although Zap may not do much damage, it does enough to change simple interactions, like one-shotting minions with Musketeers or one-shotting Zappies with Elite Barbarians. For the most part, you will use the Zap Stun to reset the Inferno Dragon, Inferno Tower, and Mighty Miner's beams, but another good feature is you can retarget troops. For example, if your opponent's tower is locked onto your Musketeers, you can use the Zap to potentially relocate into any mini-tank you may have in front of that Musketeer. You can also use that half a second stun to hopefully get a little bit more damage onto your opponent's tower, which can help in the long run. And since Zap can be placed anywhere around the arena, you can use this as a spell cycle in case you need a little bit more damage to win the game. Amazing defense, questionable offense. Let's talk about the Elite Barbarians. Some slang for you guys. You can also call these guys the E-Babes. All the cool kids are doing it, so I would recommend saying that from now on. This card has amazing stats, but it can be a bit tricky. The E-Babes are super powerful and work good together. Their high damage allows them to shred tanks, but with their slow hit speed, it makes them super vulnerable to swarm. You may recall I just said the Elite Barbarians work super good together, however, they might work a little bit too well together. For example, if your opponent places swarm troops, they will work together to take down each swarm troop, which is impractical since they already one-shot the troop, so that ends up with one barbarian wasting their full potential. So when you pair Elite Barbarians with Zap, this makes them an unstoppable combo on offense. Another thing to keep in mind that the E-Babes have a super far sight range, which makes them super easy to kite. So if your opponent has a building targeting troops such as Ice Golem, don't be surprised when your opponent kites your E-Barbs away. This also means if you're going to rush your opponent's tower, you have to know what cards they have. If they have an Ice Golem, they're basically going to counter your E-Barbs, so don't rush without thinking. Whenever you hear people talk about Elite Barbarians, you may hear them say that they take no skill and can easily take towers. This is not true. If you want to play them properly and do a ton of damage to your opponent's tower, you have to know when to place them and when to support them. That also means you have to keep in mind what cards your opponent may have before trying to rush with the Elite Barbarians, because if they have something that hard counters them, you just wasted elixir. When using the extra card in single elixir, I would recommend using them on defense and have a slight counter push if the enemy survive. And if an opponent ever overcommits on a push, you can use the Elite Barbarians as bridge spam and potentially take down their tower. Just remember to bring some support with them, such as Heal Spirit and Zap. When double elixir hits, I would recommend using them to support Three Musketeers by either splitting them or keeping them together. But the latter half is usually the better option. Whether you split them or not really depends on the situation, but for the most part, I would say keep them together because they are just so devastating by themselves. And if you do put them with your Musketeers, always pair them with a single one so your pushes are more equal in size and don't get countered by a spell. If you do decide to split them, be wary of what your opponent has on the field because they may end up going in one direction either way. The Heal Spirit provides outstanding support for a low cost. This deck has some very expensive cards, so you have some cheap cards to make up for it. For the most part, the Heal Spirit is nothing more than a quick medic for the Musketeers and Elite Barbarians, but it can have other uses as well. You can use the Spirit to absorb some damage, which can help against stuff like Princes, Sparky, and even the Bandits. For the most part, the Heal Spirit is nothing more than another cycle card to cycle your deck, but it does have some offensive potential as well. The Golden Knight is the ideal tank for the Three Musketeers. Golden Knight is a 4 elixir champion with a 1 elixir dash ability. This ability speeds up his movement speed until he performs his dash, which can dash up to 10 units. This dash is very useful since if chained properly, can connect to your opponent's king tower. For the most part, this dash ability does a good job of taking down swarm troops with the exception of Skeleton Army, since there are just too many skeletons for his dash. Although this dash is very good, it is very easy to counter, so be careful from spirits and skeletons. His dash recharges every 10 seconds, which means you can use multiple dashes if he can survive long enough. Also, he may hit fast, but he's not the best tank killer. Save your Elite Barbarians for that. And he is very tanky and fast, so he can support your Musketeers very well. The Bandit provides fast and cheap support. The Bandit is fast and can get a lot of chip damage if your opponent isn't careful. For the most part, she provides quick bridge spam for Musketeers. Her dash works from a 3.5 to 6 tile range, and she is invincible during that dash. You can use this dash ability to your advantage. Your opponent creates a bridge for your bandit to dash to their tower. This can be useful for slight chip damage, but don't always depend on it, since it's up to your opponent whether this works or not. During her dash, she is immune to all damage. You can use this to your advantage to take down charge attacks from the Prince, Dark Prince, and even Sparky if timed correctly. But for the most part, this invincibility isn't too notable, except for those few exceptions. Other than that, use her as a cycle card and defense in single elixir, and when double elixir hits, use her to support your Musketeers. The Royal Ghost basically has the same role as the Bandit, so I won't be going too much into it. Basically, use him as a mini tank, and he also provides excellent splash for your troops. Ghost can also be useful with invisibility. He can go under air troops and sneak to your opponent's tower. If he survives on defense with slight health, this may force your opponent to use spells on him, so keep that in mind. But be careful when using him on bridge spam along with the Bandit. These two troops can be used very easily to activate your king tower with Tornado. And that's basically everything you need to know about the Three Musketeers. Now, there are some concepts that I haven't talked about, such as bridge spamming when your opponent's low and stuff like that. But for the most part, this video will give you basically all the general knowledge you need to know about this deck. If you have any questions about this deck, make sure to let me know in the comments down below. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. And if you found this video helpful, make sure to leave a like. But with all that being said, thank you guys all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys all in the next video of Clash Royale. Bye-bye.